Thank you everyone for being here today for this talk on the use of family archives within the North African context. My name is Jessica A.MAL and I'm here from A.MAL projects, and we are super happy to be hosted by Liverpool Arab Art Festival. This event came out of a previous event we did last year with Dardishu, which was called Red Gold Reflections, and we hosted a discursive workshop which was run by Elodie Sacher, who is here today, Layla Gamaz, and also Imane Zoubai, who is also here today. But that event was oversubscribed, and I think it overrun by like 2 hours or something. So we're really happy and lucky that Liverpool Arab Arts Festival has given us this chance to develop the work further in more depth. And because it's split across 2 events we're having today, which is a discussion with some practitioners, and then we have also a publicly open workshop as a 2 separate events, so we can really dig into this fully. So now I'm gonna ask Elodie to share a beautiful Miro board, which is a collection of research and topics of the panelists. And I'm gonna ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. So Salma, Elodie, you go first. Who's going first? Oh.
Yeah, I will go first.
Yeah.
As you can see on this board, we have already like a variety of different links to archives, archival objects, which also expand or extend the notion of archives. As Jessica already referred to it, we already hosted kind of this conversation before together with Layla Gamaz. So you can also see her work on the board at the right hand corner. And today we're going to talk also with other researchers and artists from North Africa to extend even more the conversation about archives from North Africa. So I will just briefly refer to the archive I choose for this talk today. It's the one of my grandfather who traveled through Morocco in the 1960s, so 1 decade after the Moroccan protectorate. So also relating to my background, I'm like a media scholar, especially interested in photography's historical as well as contemporary dimensions within the context of North Africa. So it was like still a lot of curiosity from my side to see that a part of my French family traveled through Morocco, also like a travel group which grew up in a context when French still hold colonies and protectorates around the world. And here in the picture I chose, you can see the group of French people on the left-hand side of the picture being in Rabat, and other locals, inhabitants of Rabat on the right-hand side. And like looking at this archives, I don't take it only as a source of material culture, but I'm interested in the gestures and the gazes which crystallize in archives, also which predate the actual photo print. So also here we already have like an non-conventional usage of material archives, which already looks at more gestural ways how to understand an archive, or about what is actually archived in photographs, even if we archive the actual photo print. And I think we will have a fruitful conversation about performativity, orality. So I would just pass on the like how you say it, the voice to Imane to talk a bit about her archive.
Thank you, Elodie. I'm so happy to join you for this time too, to speak about the family archives. And as you can see, this is this is the same board we used last year talking about family archives in North Africa with Elodie and Leila, and we're still keeping the old layers, and we added some new ones for this year. And I'm happy to be working this way, that that we keep developing and updating this board. So here I want to share with you these two pictures that I captured from a video from a family wedding in 2019. And I'm a visual artist, and I'm so interested in orality, in musicality, in poetry, and my practice consists on how to show, how to visualize this oral arts in a way that shows its cultural landscape, reflects the collective, the imaginary collective that is so related to land, to landscape. And here in the pictures, we see women holding a table with on the top of her head full of bread, and dancing with it at the beginning of the wedding. I'm not saying this is a ritual or something. It's but I don't want to refer to it as anything, but it just means so much. This scene of a woman dancing with bread, and right after this frame, another woman came with sugar. And just to know that people coming to feast and parties, they bring as gifts flour, grains, sugar, khubz, bread to attend while attending to the wedding. And here in these pictures, we can see it's captured this moment of celebration, and also the importance of these two elements in celebrations. And I think here you are speaking about bread and sugar, and we would love to pass the voice to Salma, who's also interested into food. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Imane. Yeah, I was very intrigued about the bread. I know I'll definitely come back to you and email you separately about it. A friend of mine just asked me yesterday about wedding traditions in North Africa, actually, when it comes to food. So that's very timely. I'm very, very excited to be here and be part of this conversation that has already happened before. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to engage in such a multidisciplinary, but also transnational, regional conversation that I think doesn't happen as often as it should be. So thank you for that. My name is Salma Serry. I'm a food researcher and scholar. I'm currently doing my master's degree in food studies at Boston University. I'm based in Cairo at the moment, although moving quite soon, relocating. I work with food history, specifically interested in the undocumented food histories and the quotidian or the everyday food histories that kind of push back and challenge notions of national cuisines and official heritage. And so I approach archive perhaps in a way that kind of stretches what constitutes legitimate sources of food history that can be part of an official heritage or official archive. Perhaps I mean, food specifically is perhaps kind of new to the academia or academic field as a study, as a niche, relatively, of course, to other fields. And so I'm really interested in how we can define and see what we can connect different kind of notions and ideas of what happens in the everyday life, and then have it be a source of studying, a source of examining and understanding histories, and also our future. It's always linked, you know, the conversation of history is always, can never happen without, you know, where we are right now in the present, but also in the future. So most of the materials that I look at are, you would say, historical materials, and they should be archival material, yet they're rarely archived. They're rarely considered as legitimate. If you zoom in on the image, exactly, thank you, Elodie. So here we see some examples of what may constitute as archival material that have culinary information and knowledge and legacy or histories. We see menus, for instance, we see food packages, but it could also be things that are extremely informal, like a mother's notes, taking down recipes while hearing, you know, a recipe from her neighbor or from a radio, and she would perhaps, you know, scribble it down on the back of a you know, a sticky note, or what used to be you know, remember the calendar turnover pages. Things like that rarely get archived, and so these are the kind of materials I'm interested at, and I try to share that through my platform, Sufra Kitchen on Instagram, coming through and sharing these things that I come across in an effort to kind of reapproach how we define food history in Swana. So that's a very general overlook. I'm very excited to talk more in depth, perhaps, and see what kind of conversation we can have together.
Thank you so much for that. And it's really interesting that you've already touched on what is or isn't traditionally thought of as an archive, or what is or isn't archived. And maybe, Elodie, could you maybe give us like what the classic definition of an archive is, like the Western definition of an archive? Yeah, what is that? How do we relate to that?
I guess at the first glance, also when you speak about photographic archives, which is like my main research focuses on, it's about keeping elements of the archives in boxes, in paper, which do without acid, which not attack the pictures, to conserve them, to preserve them, but they are kind of isolated. They are not set in a context. So the archives kind of for like in the sense of wanting to preserve it over generations, they take it off of the context and set it into a new institutional one, which can be a museum or academic linked to university or other research institutes, which may or not be accessible for researchers or for a broader crowd of citizens who are interested in archives. And I mean, we have several like codes of conduct, which are kind of internationally known. They are shaped by this Western definition of archives. So how you preserve things, but always when we talk about preservation, we are not able to contextualize them or to see them and enacted. So I think for photographs, it's less a problem than for certain other elements which are archives, which normally are linked to a context where the elements can be performed or part of a performance. And also this archive, like we're talking about things which are materialized often. I mean, now I think Salma and Imane can add certainly new aspects to it, because what I see, what museums archived the last centuries, it's especially manuscripts, photographs, books, like also linked to that we see that history, to be factual, has to be written down. and also like kind of supporting a vision of a universal historiography, which has to be written down. And that's why I think lots of archives, folklores, or other historiographies, other cosmologies, other ways of understanding history, like perceptual culture in general, I would say. But of course, there's certainly things going on, thanks to artists like Imane and researchers like Salma, that we can extend more and more this notion. And a thing we certainly going to circle back to is of course, who's keeping these archives. But I think this is maybe a question for later on.
Yeah, so you mentioned this is the traditional practice of archiving within Western academia and museology, and that one of the things that you mentioned as being an alternative to that is orality, right? And how, so it would be interesting to hear, yeah, what are the alternatives to that form of archiving, particularly within a North African context where oral histories, oral knowledge is so prevalent and so important within our cultures. And maybe Imane wants to jump in on this, like, because I know you work a lot with orality and oral history. So what is an oral archive, or how are oral archives in opposition or an alternative to what Elodie's just described?
I think in the meaning, we cannot think of it as alternative because it's a genre of archiving itself, because at a certain period we had oral archives that were recorded, and this takes the place of a certain transmission, if you know what I mean. But is the question is this enough is that enough to speak about an oral arts archives, to only record? And this brings us to the ethic of recording, meeting with the people, the categories we make, the way we organize the work and everything. But here I want to talk more about it gets more delicate when we speak about oral art archives, because it imposes itself by the form it takes. It's sound, it's oral, it's about the events, it's about the moment. And I think that recording is important. The encounter, the whole experience of archiving oral arts is enormous, and I think the recording should be also linked to a context, giving an understanding to the oral arts we're interested into archiving. And since I started working on music and traditional poetry and oral and feasts in Morocco, well, in an arts practice, the idea is to reinvent what could be just archived and give something more than just the sound. And it gets through this material side, the ecology, the environment of the orality, which is so important into creating these forms of art. So I think every form of archiving is important: writing, recording, painting, drawing. But thus there is so much more work to do here when we speak of in the context of North Africa, because the Western idea of archiving is not universal. Actually, it's not something that we can project in into the whole cultures. And it's something that each culture, each community chooses and values what's to be archived and what's not, and the way to do it, and the way to share it and make it also accessible to the world. And as you can see here, speaking of archives, I only have these two pictures, but my idea for I will just give a brief idea of the performance as an example to speaking about how to define archives. So here you can see so much soil in the pictures, and I think with taking the distance over the work, and I think in this work specifically, besides the gesture, the chants, the presence and everything, soil was a huge material archive in this work, and the touching the soil is considered as an act of reminiscing, of remembering, and symbolically, I think it means something, and it's somehow, you know, challenges this way of thinking of archives as something, you know, written and institutional, and you know, the Western idea or the modern idea of archives that we can see.
Elodie, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I would like to jump in because I have a question about if you have a notion of how people understood or read your performance, because also what kind of how you define your gesture of performing, laying out the soil and laying out the soil and harvesting itself as a form of archiving. But your performance, do you see it as also a gesture of archiving, or whether as a gesture of mediation, like to mediate gestural archiving in Morocco to a German public or in an international crowd at the Documenta? Like how you kind of contextualize your performance?
And actually, just before you answer that, maybe give a little bit of context about what this performance is, so that the public can get some context about where this is being performed and who commissioned it and things like that.
Thank you for your questions. This performance had place in Documenta 15 in Castle last month, and it's called Our Bread Ready Yet, and in Darija وش طبت الخبيزة ولا مازال, and it refers to this game that we play that came from a traditional tale of Jrada Malha, and the idea is that we are playing, and each of us is the one who his bread first ready yet is the winner, you know. And but it's you know, this is the link to the oral material, and the idea was like to make bread out of soil, or just to bring out all the elements of bread making in place. And also I sewed the bags where we put grains in the form of fields, and the idea was to lay out these fields as and the soil and the flower, and as a musical territory, as the material of that visualize the environments where I could that I could make for the performance. And my idea was not forcément a mediation, because I had to think a lot whether if I can sing the chants, whether I would need translation or just not say anything, because I also had someone from the audience, this man came at the end and told me, "Is that a ritual?" And it's not, you know. But I this is why I thought of laying out a certain territory to start with. I was aware that I am in front of a foreign or international public, so how would I speak of my uh, oral culture without getting into without being lost in translations and you know, thinking so much about it, if you know what I mean. So I think it was well, the way I lived it, it was all about the moment. At certain points, it was about, you know, this common feeling we have for the soil, whether we have a different cultures, different traditions, different way of seeing the word and expressing it. I think the soil was so central into bringing the attention about this material and its relationship to my own orality. And I think the archival, I don't think I can speak that of it as an archive for now, but maybe later on it could be something, it could be not. But I think I tried to make the performance something that's so anchored in the present moment, and also to things that I have received from my family. And there is something that I would love to talk more about the ethics that's also related to the performance, but I would love to hear what Salma would think about that, since she's interested into, you know, bread and cheese, and her practice might bring out more ideas about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Imane. Are you sure you're not a food artist? I mean, I'm seeing bread again. That's really interesting. The project is, and I think it might be a, I don't know, question to you and to Elodie as well.
I'm sorry,
and
but
myself.
Food and music are no different.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. But your role as an artist, you know, and how artists or how archived are viewed differently in art versus, let's say, academia. I'm really interested in that because recently, over this past year, I've been commissioned a number of projects from a couple of art institutions, namely Art Jamil, Hi Jamil in Saudi and in Dubai as well. And I've worked on both projects were looking at food history of the region. One was mainly on Dubai, working with menus, food menus as an archival material. And it basically resulted in an exhibition that is still ongoing until August. And then another project in Saudi was looking at the food history of Jeddah, modern food history. And so, you know, often as someone who came in from academia as a scholar or as an independent researcher as well, I found a lot more freedom to work within the framework of the arts, quote unquote, than perhaps in academia. So I don't know what you both, you know, see your views on perhaps how different, not just regions, consider and think and approach archives differently, or the notion of an archive differently, West versus East, or, you know, whether you're you come from, you know, a post-colonial or a still colonized, you know, region or geography, versus perhaps being somewhere in the West, but also the privileges that, whether both as academics or as artists, we have over the public to access certain archives, or even the privilege of thinking and approaching and reflecting on it differently. Maybe it's an open question. I don't know if you guys want to have time to think about it, and we can discuss it later.
Something that I really wanted to pull out of what Imane described about the performance was, you mentioned touching the soil as an act of remembering, and this is something that I've picked up on as a difference from what Elodie was talking about earlier, and now kind of touches on your question, Salma, because we have the archive in whatever sense we understand it as, but what Imane described was the act of remembering, and potentially is that what's missing within this more traditional or academic, as you've just mentioned, framework, is that the archive isn't part of the act of remembering. So for Imane in this performance, it was the soil, touching the soil, which enables us to remember. And maybe is it with food, it's the actual tasting, right? So you can work with these archives of menus or of recipes, but is it actually is that what's missing? Is it the touching, the tasting, the embodied experience? And I wonder, is there a place for that in our practices as artists or historians or academics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting you touched upon that, the tactile maybe quality to memory, because memory it can be so surreal. It's something that it can never be so structured, right? And maybe that is the tension between memory and academia. But of course, in anthropology, and there are always, you know, a certain existing and established frameworks to access memories, such as memory work and you know, doing oral history interviews, and of course there's some history on that as well as an established area of study. But yet I still struggle with the idea that we still need to document and write down a memory for it to be a legitimate source, you know? I mean, at the end of the day, memory still needs to be perhaps activated in a way, like teased, like you said, with some sort of I don't know what the word is. Yeah, activated
Senses.
perhaps. Yeah, with the senses. Like for instance, with your case, Imane, touching of something or tasting the food, or I would say even just having a conversation about things. In my case, it could be the fact of going back and just immersing myself as a researcher in these materials, and then listening to this mute voice that that food has. And perhaps here I'm remembering a quote from Annie Hawk-Lawson. She's a food researcher, food scholar. It's on the mirror board, just to quote it correctly. She mentioned how food holds these mute voices that then becomes you know, an important way to listening to history and listening to the multi-layered aspects of who we are and how we do food and how we think about it and how it embodies our culture, our race, our class issues, our you know, our politics and socioeconomic issues, and all that is kind of embodied in whether it's food or music, like in the case of Imane. Yeah.
Yeah, I would, because I think it touches base on a lot of things, like this ambivalence of working with archives. Also I feel that in the conversation, the term archive feels like a burden, Maybe like if you have other linguistic terms which may be more suitable for you, an archive in context, we could use them instead. Because yeah, as said, archive is kind of a very dominant and term which is already has like a burden which carries it with it. And I think what archives, or like researching in archives in academia, it's often that we are not talking about our own family archives. So we exclude a kind of subjectivity, because anyway, academic writing is often, at least in Germany, very conventional or conservative in this, excluding subjectivity or contextualizing one's own position as a researcher. But I think it's actually important, and I think artists, referring also to this question, have a more sense or awareness that actually how we access and approach archives shapes the archive. It's not just about which elements we include or exclude, this of course, but it's also what we make out of it and how we use it. So I think that I want to also, because you jumped to a quote, so I will use the moment also to jump to a quote. It's from Ariella Azoulay. She's talking actually about photography, and that photography, especially Western travel photography or studio photography in North Africa, departed from a very disciplinarian gaze. And this also counts, I think, for archives. And I think the system of archive, the systematic structuring of archives, the thinking in categories is what excludes. It's not what it makes it more clear. Actually, it's what it makes it more unclear and certain. It depends on the perspective. And she says that vernacular photography or travel photography may have, so it's not her saying that vernacular photography has this aspect, but I'm linking it to the archive of tourists, French tourists traveling from Morocco after the protectorate, that there may be aspects of new beginning with unpredictable ends. And I think this also counts for archives, relating to how we approach and access archives. So that even if we're talking about 19th century photography, staging, stereotypes, professions, how people would look like in this kind of carte de visite formats, which people could take it to their home in Europe and kind of relate to their imaginaries and perceptions and expectations, and how this is translated later on in postcards. And I think Imane knows this profession of the gerab, which is our kind of staged and made like more looking like a type of person, not like a human being. And how in the photo album of my grandpa, we encounter the gerab, and how the question is how does it restage this kind of disciplinarian gaze, also being part of an Orientalistic archive, or does vernacular photography may add something which is unpredictable, because you cannot stage reality as such as you encountered on the streets. And I think in the second photograph of the gerab of my grandfather, we can see that the gaze, which predates the actual photograph, the gaze of my grandfather, who's French, who may have kind of absorbed this information about the gerab before traveling to Morocco, and now wanted to kind of also snap this profession, encounters a reverse gaze. And that here we have an interaction of gazes and an encounter, which makes photography even more interesting than just considering it as material culture. And even if we can talk about it like in a classical archival way, this is an example of just showing how we can approach it in a different way to uncover layers. So I think in academia and in artistic research, which I think in some respects already is sometimes part of academic researching, depending how you define academic research, can be very nourishing to take also a step back from a stiff academic perspective.
Elodie, do you want to just describe like briefly the story of like what is the Gurab for people who are not aware, and also kind of describe what is going on a little bit in these pictures, because it is a really interesting step by step that I know we've heard you talk about before, but just for people who haven't.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my grandfather traveled in Morocco in 1965. Morocco gained its independence in 1956. And what is interesting actually is that this travel group, they are not really friends, they are colleagues. And they decided to travel together because one colleague had a car, and it was still a luxury to travel for middle-class people in France to a foreign country, which is not in Europe. And they decided to not travel to Algeria because they were scared of the reaction of Algerians. And they thought that Morocco would provide more safety for French travelers, which is also linked to a different entanglement of like difference of French protectorate and Algeria being considered as being part of France. And my grandfather told me that they actually encountered Moroccans, of course, but they didn't have any real conversation. And I think one should not over-interpret images because they just are a snapshot of a moment. But I mean, this group picture, you have more than one where you really feel a closeness and at the same time very distant. So geographically in the space, they're close to each other, but I mean, the composition of the picture seems to be not staged, but it kind of mediates a bit what my grandfather told me about the picture, the whole experience of traveling in Morocco without overrating the meaning of one picture.
So by this, are you referring to the fact that there's three men kind of facing one way, looking out over a hill, and to like Moroccan people facing the other direction?
Yes, it's I want to stress that we should not too much interpret into this picture, but it kind of, that's why it shows it at the beginning, because it really reflected what my grandfather was telling me, how they didn't really encounter Moroccans, or were not really talking to Moroccans, just moving through the country, and they kind of let it trace, not just by the photo prints, but by the gestures and gazes. I think it's more about the encounters, which kind of crystallizes the whole experiences, and which we can see through seeing gaze and gestures predating the actual pictures. And what is very I was not expecting it, but because I was like researching about Orientalistic photography before, especially studio photography, and also postcards. And postcards, the Garab, it's a water carrier, especially in 19th century, also before, came with him like a bowl, I don't know, like this bowls where you could drink water, and having out of sheepskin or goat skin, water. It's like a how you say it?
Like a sack.
Un sac. I just don't know how to say it in English.
A bag, probably. Like a leather bag. Yeah.
A leather bag made of skin. And you see they like this postcards have the name like Le Beau Gerab, the beautiful Gerab, or the Moroccan Gerab. So it's not about the human, and it's about a type of person. And I was surprised that especially the one, this one who has really the typical professional gear, everything you would imagine which a Gerab could have. My grandfather found like an equivalent, like 50 years later, and he felt the urge to take a picture. And I don't know, I don't think that my grandfather saw the postcard I just showed before, which is from around 1900, but it's a bit like, it's when you go through the album and you see this similarity, you stop a moment and you think about it. And just afterwards, so also here, just to say, you see also he has a bell, so often they ring the bell to give people that people know that they are around to distribute water on hot days, especially. And also in the leather bags, they often collected silver coins, which they sewed onto the bag. And it's often a profession passed from generation to generation, from father to son. And I think if you go nowadays to Marrakesh, you see some of them, but also in Casablanca, but they are not really doing their profession anymore. People take pictures with them. So you see also society is changing. Also, there's not anymore the need to get water from a gerab. It's not only about tourism, but of course, they found a new profession due to tourism. Not just tourism from Western countries, also Moroccans take pictures with them. And what is interesting is that here we see this kind of encounter. We see that the picture is not just referring to the gaze of the photographer, but also the one of the photographed. And this is something you just have in vernacular photography, in amateur photography, we can call it, and not in the so-called studio photographies where everything was staged from A to Z, and which was also used as travel souvenirs. Yeah, this is a bit of a context to this little archive.
I think Elodie, I think the photography medium has brought a lot to human history. I mean, it's changed the arts at certain points, and also the way we live in the moment, and we live in the world, and we travel, and we capture moments. And I think photography, since it started, it's been a very important medium for archives, especially.
Yes,
and yeah.
I just wanted to add that what is kind of foreclosed often if somebody teaches photography in Western universities, it's local photography history. So for instance, we don't know so much about how locals, especially in the case of Morocco, there's not so much known about when locals started to use photography. We know about the Sultan Moulay Abdelaziz, which was shortly. Yeah, also, but this is especially linked to cinema. And what is interesting is that already around 1900, the Sultan of Morocco, when Morocco was still independent, used photography in his palais. But just to say that here also the photographic archive, as we know it globally, is often referring to photography like it is invented in Europe. But of course, there's a history before photography, which is also linked to the North Africa and West Asia, and which is we don't refer so often. So I think there's lots of lots of work also in this field of photography, even if academics, especially Western academia, lays it already very out of a history of photography. There's still a lot to speak about.
And I think the fact that photography was more developed in Europe and later on in North Africa and West Asia gave us this colonial archive material. You know, there's a huge this period in colonial period in Morocco where we see lots of pictures were taken by the French or Spanish media, artists, anthropologists, and also our use of photography was was for this distraction, was something that is not familiar to us. So, and now working on archives, we find ourselves having lots of archive materials that we didn't take ourselves. So I think it's very important to come back to this material and to take a look at it, to criticize it, to bring up discussions around it, and give more context to each pictures, because it's very important to have it, but it's even more important to understand it, I mean, to not define it. It doesn't define history, or I think here where archive starts being problematic. It's photography. It's a very objective medium that captures the reality the way it is, but it can also miss a lot of context, a lot of you know, the frame and the frame we choose, and everything is making it more problematic. And at certain point, I think photography in Morocco, like we see in lots of family archives, starts being, it is very present in the family gathering and events. And I think at least if you want to see a picture of someone, you'll see it in a wedding party, in a sbour, in a ختانة, in family gatherings and stuff. So or vacation, and so this is why well, this is what I wanted to say. So
I think
it's also, we can speak more about memory, because tout à l'heure you said that we are a bit allergic to the word archive, but I think when we speak of family archive, it's more about memories that we hold up to. So maybe calling them archives is taking out maybe the subjective, intimate aspects that they hold, but it also brings them to a higher, you know, status. Maybe to call your family album as an archive, it's already giving everybody access to it. It gives the right to everybody to see it, and this is where this allergy came from, and especially when it's related to the eye, because it the eye, the gaze and the camera, it's something that's exhibits, you know, the reality, and just this is why I think how it could be problematic, and especially in this context of intimacy.
I just want to draw on something that you mentioned when referring to sort of the archival material which exists about North Africa or in North Africa, is that you mentioned we're left with an archive of objects or artifacts which we haven't taken ourselves. These aren't pictures that we have, you know, we're left with a lot of material from outside in, but maybe the family archive is something we have more ownership of, and as you mentioned, it's more intimate. And I wonder if actually now is a really good time to sort of delve into how do you both, Salma and Imane, use family archive within your work. And again, you kind of touched on it, but maybe we could talk about it more on a personal level, like what are the problematics or the ethics of that, because we've touched on some from Elodie's context and perspective, but it'd be nice to hear from from you two also.
Yeah, sure. I mean, before I delve into the idea, I just want to touch back on what Elodie was saying about this heaviness and the tension and what Imane referred to as sensitivity, perhaps around the use of the word archives. And I think that might stem from the idea that we perhaps view archives as something that is that has these binaries around them. So Western versus Eastern, maybe not non-familiar and familiar, official and non-official, and then you know, perhaps then it's not that. Perhaps the use of the word archive has come from the way or the method and the frameworks that has existed in the West, but it's not a new or alien concept at all. What is an archive at the end of the day? It's a collection of things that are kept in time or preserved or saved, right? And so I think about that a lot when it comes to cookbooks. What are cookbooks and why are they part, or recipes? Let's say recipes in essence. One recipe, a page of a recipe. Would that be considered, you know, a library item or an archive? Where does it belong? Does it depend on who has wrote the recipe or how it was documented? Is it from a memory or is it from, you know, an oral transmission? How and where does it fit in? And I don't know if it matters so much. I don't know if it matters like which archive it belongs to. At the end of the day, it's a source. And regardless of where that source is, a source, and of course, I'm thinking, I put my researcher hat on, a source of knowledge or getting a deeper understanding of our histories or who we are or the context of the time. And similarly, like cookbooks, we can think of items that are not traditional, like food menus from restaurants or bills and invoices from a bakery, ads and posters that are in magazines that are usually bounded in like large, what do you call them? Mujallad or mugallad, a collection of like bound together in a folder or whatever, and kept in archives, whether newspapers archives or publishers archives, or in national archives or in libraries. But also they could be scattered around. They could be cut like clippets, you know, like people would do in in their everyday life, whether someone would look at an ad and they liked the fashion of what, you know, a woman that is holding a tray of food might be wearing a nice dress, and the woman reader might have liked the dress, and so she cut it and kept it, you know. Now to me it does inform of something, and how perhaps modernity, for instance, could play a role in both fashion and food, and how it goes hand in hand. Or in the form of letters, for instance, communication correspondences between people. Where does it end? At where is it located is not really that important to me. And especially at this day, we see on social media, especially in Egypt, but also other parts of the Arab world, a large number of social media pages on Facebook, for instance, that shares these materials publicly in a way that is extremely, quote unquote, democratized, perhaps, that kind of really challenges all these set frameworks. And it goes like, it does not matter how we, you know, who we even give credit to most of the time. And that's a problem, you know, as a researcher who's going to use this material at the end of the day, and, you know, maybe use it in a paper that I'm writing for an academic journal. The question will always come back to me, like, where did you find the source, and who owns it, who publishes it, do we have the right to? Maybe these at the end are questions that bind me as a scholar or in academia, but it does not undermine the importance of the content of this material. So for example, here's one very traditional, the Trush al-Oman levies. It's a list of rations, food rations from the British Trush al-Oman army. It was a very peculiar arrangement of an army that was present in the Gulf region in the states of Oman and United Arab Emirates. And then in this, they list the exact rations for what is to be given for the Trush al-Oman levies. Some of the officers were British, but the majority, for economic reasons, they wanted them to be from Arab soldiers, or some of them were Yemeni, some of them were Omani, some of them were even Indian. And so in such official documents, we see them in the British Archive and also in the National Archive. They have both the United Arab Emirates and I think some other Gulf states have an agreement with the British Archive to kind of share these materials. And so we have one example of something that is very official that we see, but also something like a photograph that you have on the left of a family of Egyptian migrants, expats, the label or the word of what defines them as an economic migrant or a person who leaves their home country from Egypt and goes and works for in the Gulf. And we see the family, and this is a birthday. And so something that is unofficial, something that is very intimate, something that is very, could be mundane, does not mean that it's any less important than an official document. And so photography comes in mind, and also, you know, things like what you have at the bottom. This is my at the top, the image at the top from a notebook. This is my grandmother's school notebook from her domestic science subject back in 1930s when she was just 7 years old. This is a recipe for tomato sauce. So something like that, where does it end up nowadays? It was kept in my family. Can it be called an archive? Is it a library? Is it, who cares? At the end of the day, it's something that really tells so much about the state of girls' education at the time, of the role of women and their place, and also a lot more when it comes to the system of education, how a recipe is written, the transmission of knowledge. And we see a very, without going too much into the details of the context of the time, but education was in Egypt at the time influenced by the British mode, or the British education system. And so we see recipes written in a very classic way of ingredients, and then step by step as instructions, in a mode that is very different than how this recipe would be told by my grandmother to my mother or to any other, maybe their neighbor, on the phone as an oral transmission. It would not be listed as, first you're going to gather all these ingredients, you know, 1/2 pound of tomatoes and 1 small onion. No, she would just start right away with the instructions, with the ingredients embedded into the instructions. And perhaps that's a different mode of a knowledge transmission that is interesting when it comes to food. But yeah, I mean, one question that comes to mind is food meant to stay static? Are archives meant to stay static? And I was one I wouldn't say a quote from a book, because I attended this workshop back in Beirut in February, and anthropologist Kirsten Sheed from American University of Beirut was attending. She was talking, and she said something that really stayed with me, that was really interesting, was how archives think that they're looking back when they're in fact looking forward. And it just stayed with me, and I kept thinking about it. I'm like, am I, how in the role of an archive, is it just to keep things and document them? How can my role and my experience of it and my interaction with it may in fact be actively in the present and looking towards the future? Maybe that's a question I'd pose to you both, Elodie and Imane.
This reminded me of my mother. She used to spend a lot of hours listening to radio and just copying recipes, and she has a lot of copybook filled of recipes that she writes and never make any of them, but just the pleasure, maybe writing them down gives the feeling that you're doing it. And your question was about
just the role of the archive, and how, or perhaps how we approach archives and how we think of them as something from the past. And I see this a lot actually when the word nostalgia is thrown around. In the art field, it's a big cringe. It's like nostalgia is not a good thing. Let's go past that. And I understand.
It used to be a good thing. It used to be a good thing.
And perhaps it's
and that's
still
quite
is.
ironic. It's quite nostalgic of nostalgia.
Exactly. I mean, then maybe says something as to why there's a need for us to be nostalgic. What does it try to heal or attempt to problematize even?
Why?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, why not be? We all get nostalgic sometimes, but it just got stigmatized. This sense that we have seen many of nostalgic things that made us just not want to be nostalgic anymore, if you know what I mean.
I think nostalgia is a bit to look from the present into the past, and what would be added, which is not nostalgic, is to shape the future. I have the impression that just like we all look from the like we also have a common, if you use the term of archive, we look into the past, and I mean also what is not nostalgic is to understand the present like nowadays, for reshaping the future, and then this nostalgic formula becomes something other.
I think also this is. Oh, sorry, Imane, you go.
I'm sorry, but I think sometimes we have the right to be nostalgic if we didn't had enough received from our transmissions, from our past. We just have the right to go back and make this enough research, enough to not actually be nostalgic, just to be aware of who you are. Sometimes it's just stigmatized and seen in a pejorative way, but it shouldn't be. What's nostalgic actually is the method, is the approach, but it's never nostalgic to bring out something that was never spoken about or never relevant or that never heard of it. You cannot be nostalgic to something that you barely know, but maybe the approach you see, the way you seek this material or the way you talk about it, or this is just that much emotion keeping you out, giving you even more distance with the events and with the
distance is an interesting word. I mean, you made me think of how actually nostalgia kind of, I think in its definition, it has some links to loss or pain because of the loss, that you don't have it anymore. And so you're really right, Imane, about this, how the point that we or some of us have the right to be nostalgic when they haven't had the chance to have their history acknowledged. This is something on a personal level I can perhaps relate to, being a fourth generation migrant of Egyptian parents, grandparents, and a great grandparent who moved to the UAE back in the 60s, late 60s. And the migrant, and I choose migrant very carefully, the migrant community there, first of all, never refer to them as migrant. Like if I go and say, oh, you're a migrant to my parent, to my mother or my father, they would say, we never consider ourselves as migrants. And I've had that conversation come up a lot among my friends. And it's usually the word of choice is expat or a non-citizen or non-national, but it all points to the fact that there is a continuous movement, especially within the Gulf. There's no longevity, there's no route to citizenship, and therefore there's no route to staying. And so there's always a continuous movement in and out. There's an erosion, if we're going to use an ecological term, or a geographical term. There's an erosion of that movement, of that, of these memories, of these tangible items even move as people move. The collection of photographs, the personal archives or the albums or the recipe books or the pamphlets or bills and invoices or whatever that has been collected and part of a person's belongings or a family's belongings move. And so when they move, they're not part of the official heritage or a legacy of a community, especially when we're talking on a national level and where that plays and where they fall in or be represented or not in from a institutional point of view.
This is why I think, I'm sorry, you wanted to say something? Elodie, you wanted to say something?
It's just very briefly, just saying that I think the Arab Image Foundation is doing this work of not transcending the national borders in the region of North Africa and West Asia to collect this vernacular photographies you were referring to, capturing moments of feast, celebration, vacation, to like just with the medium of photography to kind of archive these things which are normally not part of national archives because they don't suit archival categories. Also, sometimes post-colonial national narratives and myths also have huge blind spots. And
absolutely, yeah.
I mean, Umnia El-Shakri, it's a writer, she's talking about it, about also the blind spots of post-colonial national historiography. Yeah, just saying that there's like this great work of local association, institutions, also like A.MAL, which Imane knows, doing another way of archiving things which often were not archived yet.
Yeah, and I think it's also a very relevant thing to any diaspora community, I suppose. And yeah, I think that there's a conversation on any nationalist or nationalism, does not occur, especially in our region, without a certain post-coloniality that is attached to it. And yeah, I mean, personally, perhaps going back to what I was saying about pain and loss, maybe what I'm on a personal level and what I'm trying to do perhaps is also get some sort of, not just an understanding as a scholar, but on a personal level, some healing, some therapy work that comes from seeing and saving and keeping things that are otherwise at a danger of being lost somehow. And on a level that is personal, kind of makes me understand my own history and my own perspective, my own family legacy of life. Maybe Elodie, you'd think on a relevantly related way, considering you're working with your grandfather's archive as well?
I think in general that we talk about family archives facilitates some to contextualize archives and to bring in subjectivity, nostalgia, as relevant feelings and perspectives and vantage points. Because, and of course, this are also linked to broader other elements which are archived, but I think here the notion of a family archive is very helpful to not exclude subjectivity and emotional ties as being not relevant for research. Especially, I think, when it comes to orality and performativity, like also how Imane is speaking about her work, also reenacting, laying the soil, or maybe not reenacting, just acting it. Like it's hard to talk about it, I feel, in English, which is also not my native language, it's another language. And here it's the thing what is lost in translation. So also I think there are lots of linguistic twists and turns which maybe should be also introduced into research. Yeah.
Absolutely. Context is important too. Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
I think the relevance of archives in it's just to keep this continuity, and in a post-colonial context where we had a rupture, where in a cultural rupture, and that impacts a lot of social links, rapports sociaux, economics, know-hows of making the land, of recipes as well, of crafts, and who also undermined the crafts and the arts in Morocco, and were seen as crafts, as artisanat, and also introduced the fine art school and teach a certain way to make arts. But since then, a lot of engaged artists and researchers at the post-colonial phase were saying that maybe it's the time to look back to our culture, to our traditions, and recognize them, as give them back, the title that they are arts. Actually, they are not just traditions, just rituals. I mean, some of them are, but I mean, being rituals or traditions is not something that making them less or less of the other arts. And this is why working with family archives at certain level in my practice personally is also, it's delicate. It's how there is always the history that is weighing on you, the heritage, everything that keeps you not want to seem, I felt that, especially when I was in a castle, because it's the first time I was performing or in front of a stranger public, that we don't share the same collective memory. And it took me, I was thinking a lot about how would I, because my arts practice is based on the oral arts, and to poetry, celebrations, the visual aspects of the space of the parties, and in the Moroccan context. So how to present all that without, how to present the core of it, which is actually the work of the land allowed to gave birth to all these cultural manifestations as music, especially. So this is why it is important to go back and you know, stay aware of what could be nostalgic. How would you approach that? How would you ask questions about that? So I also this is why I insist on the remembering part, more on just coming and performing. I know these songs, I know them by heart, so I'm just, and it was true moments. These chants that I performed on the performance, I recorded them with my aunt, and I recorded a lot of conversations with her about the wedding parties and the work of land and how they make bread. And but I was thinking, how would it be ethical to, for example, put on the sound of my aunt while the performance? And first of all, I thought maybe to create like kind of safe space to play the sound. And I say maybe a feminine space, because I know she wouldn't mind if she was heard only by in a feminine space, because this is where these form of arts are created, are allowed, are admissible. So I said maybe a feminine space would be good to play the recordings I made with my aunts. And then we had lots of discussion about that with the team A.MAL, with whom I work together. And then I said maybe to perform them myself. But it's been just few months that I knew the chance it wouldn't be that perfect, you know, not that good. That I said, anyways, is just a way to just to just live the event. You know, there is this from another region, this Amazigh proverb who said, an event without poetry is like an event who have never existed. So here in the performance, the poetry is so necessary. No matter was it good performance or average, but I was just feeling that energy of remembering each verse, each chant during each act of the performance. And most of these chants are celebrating the gathering of people, the land, love stories, mothers being separated from their girls the day of the weddings, and how, you know, and people were intrigued. What are these chants are about? Is there something specific you're talking about? And I said, it's just love stories chants, land chants, just normal chants, nothing special. And this is also to talk about ethics and the way to keep the transmission, keep the expression, and also preserve the consent of her consent, by the way, with whom she gave me her time to record, to share with me these precious poetry. So should find a way as valuable to pass it out to the audience as well. And yeah.
Yeah,
What about you? Have you ever encountered ethical questions or problematic in your field work, in your research, or
so Iman, I think
have any thoughts
I just
about that?
want to jump in here because what we've touched on, we've touched on so much stuff, and I think it's really important what you're talking about. And I just wanted to bring up, so you've spoke about how this was the first time maybe that you performed to like a foreign audience outside of Morocco, and I think this draws on what Salma was also talking about being fourth generation, and it's also a question I think that's very prevalent for the diasporic community. Like, for example, Liverpool Arab Arts Festival is acting in Liverpool, and I think it's an important question of the ethics of using family archive when it has been removed from its former context, let's say. And I think in diasporic communities, we have a really big weight on our shoulders, or not a weight, just a big consideration on how to use or work with our family archive without self-orientalizing or without reproducing the violences of what has come before. And I find it interesting that at the end, you said at the end of your performance, you had a man come and say, oh, is this a ritual? And it is kind of representative of how, a foreign audience doesn't understand everything. But is it our right to hold something, to keep some things not understandable or not translatable, or how do we deal with this question of like using the family archive without self-orientalizing, or is self-orientalizing okay? I have spoke with some practitioners who have different views on it, so maybe Salma, what's your view on this sort of question of being removed from context and self-orientalization and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I might even just play around with the word of self-orientalizing to just make it a little broader, to include self-romanticizing, regardless of, because I kind of struggled with that, working on a piece about my grandmother, whose picture you see on the far right of the board. So working with
So
grandmothers.
beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish she was here with us today. She would have listened to our chats. But the problem that constantly faced me when I was writing this piece for the Arab Literature Quarterly was, am I placing her within these frames of that almost today, maybe in our generation, with all the nostalgic quote unquote ways of thinking of our grandmothers and their food and their role in the kitchen, kind of confines them within these frames of they're the overly generous, angelic presence that has this abundance of giving, and giving in the form of food, and always there in the kitchen creating those miracles and really, tasty, delicious creations that have so much love. But then, I constantly, I was like, what am I doing to try to move past that, and what I know about her and what I have from my conversations, from others' conversations with her, from their life and my life with her that we share, and the information I know about her and her upbringing and her past. And perhaps that could be something contextualizing, contextualizing what we're dealing with and what we have as knowledge or as material or as archives can be thought of as a way to deepen our understanding and think of what other things that are not there that we can bring into the narrative to complicate it. So, you know, context of what was going on at the time, on a political level, on the social level. Where was she in the social, you know, socioeconomic hierarchy? Where was she in terms of what was going on with girls' education at the time? Where was she with colonial and entering into a post-colonial phase? Where was she with as a woman and as a mother and as a girl who married young and was taught young in school to care for a family and have that as her priority? Where was she as a non-working woman? She never entered the work field. Her priority was always her children. What does that mean to me as a researcher, but also to me as her granddaughter, to kind of try and complicate that simple, very polished, very romanticized, very what's that filter with the black and white? What was it called?
Vintage, sepia.
Sepia, yes, exactly. To kind of try and understand more from that. And my scribblings here on the board are just maybe trying to get into a solution by, you know, thinking of how we can contextualize to kind of move beyond that past, providing a deeper understanding of the conditions that really shaped our food and shaped what we do today, and kind of really amplify what we can learn from food, or be it music or photography, all these voices it carries that are more than just food or music or photography.
I just want to pull out, I really like the word you've used there. Is it the theatre food fetish?
Yes.
Am I saying that right? Theatre.
Theta, yeah.
Theta, the theatre food fetish. I think it's a really interesting word that you've used because, again, fetish is something which is extremely on the praxis of gender. You know, it disproportionately affects certain genders, and also of race. And when we think of the grandma figure, the food, that is so much wrapped up in that. So it's really sort of great to see you recognize that, and also see how you're working to go beyond that within the context of your work. But maybe, Imane, have you encountered any kind of conflicts or struggles within your work of trying to refrain from this fetishization, romanticization, etc.?
Reductionist, I would say.
Reductionist, yeah, it is for sure. Yeah, because I think
from the public,
within your own practice. So if you're delving back into these archives, has that ever been a question for you of like, oh, am I fetishizing, or am I romanticizing? Am I reducing something in the making of this work? Because when we use family archives, we're within an artistic or however we're using them, we are taking them then out of the family, right? So are we in some way then responsible for how they're seen, how they're understood? And yeah, what do you think?
You know what I like about being in that conversation with you guys is, since last time and this time as well, is making me think of my work at this aspect of family archives of my work. But it was never my intention since the beginning. And since Elo proposed to me to participate, the first time I thought about it, I said, maybe that's not what I really do. It's not archiving. It's not anything, you know, consciously that evolves around the family archives. But speaking about it now makes me reflect about that, which is important. So as you can see, the material is more present than in a symbolic way, poetic, creating the rhythm in a musical. But we see, I mean, here are the picture I'm sharing, I mean, exclusively on the mirror board, like the picture of my father and the picture of my family there from the within. But this is not the focus of my work. It's only the people I encounter that and who knows me well knows that I came from a family where my father is a musician and my mother's family makes rugs, and you know, only the people who knows me on a personal level knows this this part of familial, intimate relationship I have with the music and orality and the crafts. But I try to express that, talk about that, and keep it in the contours of the artwork, in the material, in the symbolism, in its interaction with space, its in the practice. But I never actually referred to my family archives to be the essential material of my creation, but it's part. I mean, each artist, there is a huge part of his family transmission and history in their work, that it's hidden or more appearance, you know, more.
But also, I would argue, Imane, that like even your decision, like, so you took the recordings with your auntie of the chants before your performance, and then you decided not to actually include the recordings of her, if I understood that right. So that is that a way of protecting something, of keeping something sacred, keeping something private, and is that important within the ethics of your work? Because I know your work, and I know you work on a very, very ethical practice. So was that what was that decision to keep it sort of, to keep that as a personal archive rather than something public?
Because when I asked her to record, she first told me, "They're gonna hear me. Who's gonna hear me?" She cares about who's gonna hear that, and she said, and then she hesitated. Well, maybe you can share that, but not say that it's my name. Are they going to come look for me, or you know, this idea, I'm going to be famous or something?
Yes, so I get that a lot too, Imane. I share the same sentiment. We're working with, especially, of course, women, perhaps in more, I don't want to say conservative, I don't know what the communities in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, for instance, was my last project there. Yeah, I had the exact same sentiments and reactions. You could, or I would even perhaps suggest that I could use a change of name and a pseudonym or an abbreviation to kind of still be able to use this extremely valuable information, but otherwise very private.
Yes, and just to finish about the option why I didn't include also the recording in the performance, I also said to myself, maybe to sing them myself, it will increase the presence, this energy, the contact with the public, and instead of just throwing the voice that comes from the background as a, you know, just like cinema or some accompaniment, or I thought that it's more relevant to come up for me to incarn this transmission.
I was just because it's a lot about, do we expose our family through using elements of our family history, gathered collections, and of course, because my grandfather is also like, he is on the pictures. He is the guy, for instance, in the picture of the group on the left-hand side, who's sitting with a white blue blouse. No, blouse, it's feminine. I don't know how you say it.
Yeah, blouse or shirt.
Blouse or shirt. And for me, it was important to not just start the research with a bland critique, like saying, anyway, the travel photography of French tourists are part of an Orientalistic archive, and that's it. So for me, it was also interesting and important to talk with him about how he sees his pictures, like 50 years afterwards, and also to share with him my perspective and what I researched. And I think then it gets fruitful. So I think dialogue with, if it's possible, the dialogue with the family, also family which is part visually or orally, like Imane just referred to, it's an important part in artistic research, also in academic research.
But that's not always an option, right? That dialogue, especially if we're working with archives of people or places or things which are no longer with us, that dialogue isn't always an option. So then is the dialogue actually with the work and with the practitioner themselves?
Yeah, of course. So, but I think it gets then especially complicated in the North African context. Not just in the North African, of course, when even like you can't have a dialogue with your ancestors or with your relatives. And then additionally, you can't go to the museum close to you because actually what you would like to encounter is not in your country. But yeah, and this is, I think, that goes back to the thing that maybe family archives replace this lack because they are more accessible. But this is just a thought where I found like there's like a thread in our conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point because maybe you could talk about this more, Elodie, but a lot of, for example, Moroccan archival material is kept in France, right?
It depends. I mean, I think also Imane knows a bit the situation. You have le Centre Cinématographique Marocain. You have also les Archives du Maroc. So it's true that a big part of things which happened during the protectorate are not entirely in Morocco. They are also in France, and not so much. Also, especially for Algeria, it's very hard to access them. But also, there is the problem that even the archives which are in Morocco, which are kind of institutionalized by the Moroccan government, are hard to access for artists and for researchers living in Morocco. So this is the thing of post-colonial nation building and how they keep archives, and yeah, it's like a two. Yeah, you have to deal with two fields of problem spaces. One of being it's like outsourced, and the other is of that you even have a struggle to access archives stored in your country.
So some of the archives are lucrative. I mentioned that on, and you need to pay thousands of euros for 5 minutes audiovisual, especially audiovisual archives. I don't know the name especially, but I had a conversation. Someone told me that, and I don't doubt that because it's a way of guarding the archives, you know, and keeping them precious. The rights, it's like les droits d'auteur, and since they are the authors of these materials, so they have all the rights to make them accessible or not. And I think this has nothing to do with the ethical part of who belongs to what belongs to who. Or
I can refer, I think it was Yasmin bin Abdullah who told you, because So there's a filmmaker, Yasmin Ben Abdullah, and also her name is Rim Meshdi. She's also a Moroccan filmmaker. They had a talk about how to decolonize Moroccan archives, which you can find really easily online. And if you're more interested in the thing how national archives work, or actually hide or like make it inaccessible to some archival contents.
I think another problem with
I
national
heard from
archives.
Nader Bouhmouch.
Sorry. I was just gonna say another problem with national archives is who they exclude in terms of the representation of materials that they have. So it does not, represent everyone. It does not conserve materials from everyone. Of course, it's still selective, and at the same time, perhaps the family archives are not as selective. They're pretty representative, but at the same time, they might be for us equally hard to access because of constraints of budget, or like you said, referred to Imane, or safekeeping, like Elodie is saying, but also just the fact that it's private, it's in people's homes, and for you to gain that, you need to have a level of trust, perhaps, to gain that access. And I think that is something that perhaps is the most difficult, but the most rewarding also, working with family archives that are not ours as direct researchers, but someone else's family archives.
And I think that family archives don't create these boundaries, which you also mentioned actually on your board, with categorizations, because a receipt book, you can find it also in my grandma's and place. It's something where you don't have to think into different categories. And also I think the board reflects it pretty good, how actually talking about archives is not as systematic and easy as the word and the per definition it seems to be.
I think this is a great time to start wrapping up, because we are coming to time, but I feel like we could just keep talking for so long, and there's a whole section of questions that we didn't even touch on yet. So I guess I feel like we've kind of heard already some final remarks, but if there is any other last remarks about the family archive, about using the family archive, which anyone wants to share, to maybe share them now.
Perhaps I would just add, as a final point, and just a brief continuation of what we're talking about, is also another problem with the institutional archives, is that they're more male oriented and more male skewed, perhaps, and those who have traditionally been in positions of power to make such decisions were naturally men. And so I think that is something the family archives kind of works as an antidote, where we see a lot more, especially when it comes to food, we see a lot of influence from women.
I would argue not only in food. I think in many family archives, it's the matriarchs which pass down that information, right?
True. Yeah.
On the risk of starting a whole new topic, for example, in my family, I think that's definitely true. Songs, poems, stories, who was
even
married
photos,
to who, when, photos. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Imane, do you have any final remarks? You said everything.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think with that, I would just like to thank everyone again for coming and for sharing. And I really think this could be like a weekly podcast where we just talk about family archives for 2 hours. But thank you so much to Liverpool Arab Arts Festival also for hosting us. We will put all the links to everything we mentioned in the video description. There's also actually a really great exhibition by the Arab Image Archive, which is part of the festival this year. So anyone in Liverpool can also try and access that. And yeah, with that, I just think we'll say goodbye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
This was great.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
We'll need a part 3 soon.